Hesslinger with the Land Conservancy. So we are an independent nonprofit based in Grand Rapids here, but we cover parts of 8 counties. And the work we do within those counties is to protect and restore natural lands. But what I want to talk today about is one of our projects, the Highlands. And this is a partnership project that we are doing with Blandford Nature Center. It's in Grand Rapids. It's on the west side of Grand Rapids. And this, for us, in many ways, is a different type of project than what we have done before. It's obviously urban. It's within the city limits. It's a former golf course. And so that's not something that we typically do. We're typically working in, we identify high quality natural areas that already have high habitat value, and we're working to protect those permanently, and we're working to restore those areas as well. So just to give you an idea of, all right, so just wanted to lay out a roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about today over the next 30 minutes or so. So I want to lay out some of the context, where this site lives in space and conservation space, why it's important, why is the Land Conservancy going and buying up golf courses to begin with. And then I want to talk a lot about the habitat restoration. And I think it's helpful to think of that in a couple different phases. One, on a site like this in particular, it's important to instead of just jumping right into it, there's a number of things that have to be considered before we do any on-the-ground work. So that's kind of phase 1 of preparation. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the habitat restoration that we've begun already. And this is a relatively new project for us. It began in 2017, so only 3 years in, but there are some things that we can learn in terms of some positive things, some successes. We'll talk about those, as well as some ongoing challenges. And again, we should have time for questions at the end. So I want to start by laying the scene. And I want to start with a map. This is a map of Kent County, and this is a map showing natural communities that existed prior to European settlement. So just to orient you, this red star right here, that's the location of the site. It's on the west side of Grand Rapids. You can kind of see the Grand River corridor, the Rogue River corridor coming up here. It's not important that you discern those very subtle colors on the map or can read that tiny legend. But what this is, many of the pink areas are different forest types, oak hickory forest and beech maple forest, a number of wetland types, especially in this eastern part of the county, heavily glaciated, some different forest and savanna types on the northern part. And where this site sits is really on the intersection of a number of different community types. So inland, we have these glaciated features that are really pushing the ecology in one direction. And west of here and into Ottawa County, we have more of that lake plain geology that's driving a different set of communities. And so this site really sits at the intersection of that. So historically, incredibly diverse habitat, a range of different natural communities. And I want to show you another map. This map is similar in many ways. Again, this is a map of Kent County. The red star is where the Highlands sits. All the gray and white color on this map is habitat or natural areas that have been destroyed since European settlement through the present day. So that's all been converted to development or agriculture. We do see that there are a number of forest patches. If you can kind of squint, you can see some of these pink areas. Over here, you can see there are some different wetland and forest types following these river courses. One way to look at this is it's a pretty dire and depressing situation, and in many ways it is. Another way to look at this is all these gray and white areas are then, in theory, opportunities for restoration. I want to talk about another trend as well, as long as we're talking about declines, and that is the decline in golfing. So these are national statistics over the last decade or so. Over 1% of all golf courses close annually. There's a number of reasons for that. An aging golfing population, young people just aren't getting into it. et cetera, et cetera. That equates to over 2,000 golf courses over the past decade nationwide, which is 315,000 acres of open space. And much of that open space is then in urban and suburban environments. This has been termed the golf course gold rush for developers. So this is highly developable land, right? It's close by, it's typically close to cities. It's already cleared, prime for development, right? And so if you're going to take my optimistic viewpoint, maybe that's an opportunity for restorationists as well. And so that's exactly what happened at the Highlands. In particular, this is an aerial photo of the site. Leonard Road is just off the photo here to the south, and Oakley Avenue is this road going north and south for those of you who are familiar with this area of town. This golf course was established in 1908 by this gentleman here, Donald Ross. I am not a golfer, but apparently this guy was a big deal in golf course design back in the day, won lots of awards. This was a premier golf course in the 80s and 90s, hosted various PGA events and the like. Unfortunately, over the last decade or so, the golf course ownership changed hands and essentially ran out of money. And a developer came knocking on the door and was able to secure a purchase agreement on the property with the former golf course owner. And this is what was proposed. It was about 350 housing units on the property, pretty much wall-to-wall houses. I don't know if you could read this. I think it's pretty cute. There's a little area of open space there in the corner, and they do have a little bit of a park there. These plans got kind of released out, and there was quite a bit of backlash from the neighborhood not wanting to see this green space go away, didn't want the extra traffic of all the houses and what that would mean for the community. And so you can, this is a picture of a recent aerial photo showing the urban context. So a lot of residential here, some commercial development as well. But this doesn't just exist off by itself, right? That's Blandford Nature Center right next door. So in addition to the sort of the community not wanting this development, Blandford kind of looked over and said, hey, I bet we could do something pretty cool there. Blandford they're wonderful, they're a great partner, they're a nature center, they do environmental programming, environmental education. They don't necessarily do land acquisition or land management. And so that's where we came in. They contacted us and said, hey, can you help us secure this property? Won't go into all the details of what that transaction entailed, but essentially we were able to enter into a partnership with Blandford where the Land Conservancy was taking the lead on the land acquisition and the land restoration, working with that developer who realized he had an uphill battle trying to get that housing development in. He actually ended up being a great asset to this project. And then Blandford doing what they do best and looking at environmental programming and some of the built spaces to support that program. So really a great partnership in that it leverages the strengths of both organizations to bring about the shared vision, and that's to create a world-class urban green space that benefits both people and nature. And we're really optimistic that we can make that happen. What I'm going to focus on really, most of this talk, we could talk a lot about a lot of this stuff here, is this land restoration aspect. So let's get going on that. As I mentioned, I kind of think it's helpful to think about the restoration in two phases. One is kind of the prep work ahead of time, and then phase two is more of the implementation. So step one is really to realize this is a unique project. This is unlike anything that we've done before. This is unlike anything a lot of people have done before. There's no blueprint for this. So again, heavily urban context, a mix of land uses around there. And we knew once the public sort of realized that this wasn't going to turn into a massive housing development, they were very enthusiastic and wanted to get out and use the property. And so we were committed from day one to providing that public access and knew that we had to do so quickly. So the very first thing we did before we did anything with the habitat is establish a series of trails out there that's been important and will continue to be important throughout the course of the project. Another important thing to consider is that this site has a history of heavy ecological abuse. So prior to being a golf course, the land was cleared for agriculture in the late 1800s, as was most land around this area. And then once it became a golf course, of course, everything was manicured and kept pristine. A lot of chemicals, a lot of fertilizers were used to maintain that appearance. A lot of soil compaction and soil disruption as well. So not a lot in terms of habitat. In fact, there's really no remnant vegetation out there. As an ecologist, the first thing I go out to when I go up to a new site, I'm looking for what's there, right? What is the kind of the base ecology that we can build off of to restore, and kind of what's the framework out there? When I walked out on this site for the first time, there was nothing. I say almost no remnant vegetation because right where this arrow is pointing, there's a single white oak tree, which I think is pre-golf course. But other than that, it was turf grass border to border. The second step was to get a handle on what we're going to do with this property. So we took about 1.5 years to develop a master plan. This is showing one of the early conceptual drawings. This is not the final plan by any means. But we knew we wanted, again, to get some trails through there for the public to enjoy it. You'll see different features here, different wetlands, maybe a swale or a stream over here. And we start to suggest some different habitat areas. There's some areas that are forested, some areas that are more open. And that's really the level we needed to start going and start making more detailed restoration plans. So a lot of community input went into this, of course, as well as input from various partners. Step 3, once we had the master plan developed, is to remove the golf course infrastructure. And so there was a 40,000 square foot clubhouse there. And we looked at several ways to retain either all or portions of that building, to repurpose it into a community space or offices. And the condition of the building was such that would have cost far more money than it was worth. So we made the decision to remove that altogether. It was also just a really ugly building right in the middle of the site, and it did not speak well to the vibe of nature that we were going for. Some other maybe less glamorous infrastructure things is, golf courses rely on a series of irrigation pipes and drainage systems and electric utilities that run throughout the entire site. And so before we went digging around and planting things, we need to make sure that was decommissioned, so to speak. So that was kind of one of those unforeseen challenges. I know more now about golf course irrigation systems than I ever thought I would, working in natural areas management. And then kind of step 4 is to prepare then for future restoration. So are there invasive species that now, once this is not being treated with herbicides and chemicals all the time, are there things coming into this void that we'd rather not be there, right? So we don't create bigger problems for us down the road. We did a couple of small restoration pilot projects. This is one of those there where we planted a variety of things. Because this site is so varied in terms and disturbed in terms of soils, in terms of what the site can contain and hydrology, we weren't quite sure what was going to grow there. And so we did a series of these plots around that were able to then inform future plantings. Assembling equipment, people and partners, funding is a huge issue there. So we took about 2 or 3 years actually to raise the funds necessary to actually implement the restoration. And throughout all of this, it was really important for us to think holistically about the site, right? And when we're thinking about maybe a nature preserve that's off, in a more rural area that has high habitat quality, it's always kind of nature first, and yeah, if people want to go there, that's fine too. In this instance, we knew people were such an important part of this project, being located in the city, and make sure our restoration is planned for both nature and people. And then when we get into phase 2, which is the actual implementation of the restoration on the ground, that's the exciting stuff for me. And so I want to walk you through a couple of different habitat types that we've been working on and show you kind of the process we've used to take manicured golf course space and turn it into something that has a little bit more habitat value. And the first most logical place to start with that is grasslands. First of all, much of the site is grassland, right? Already, it was just a monoculture of turf grass, and so here we have here we're burning off that turf grass to remove that biomass, so we have a clean surface in which to plant other things into. We also, being an urban area, it can sometimes be tricky to get prescribed burns in. So we used mowing as well as another technique to again, remove that biomass of that turf grass. And then we do, at the outset, some broadcast herbicide applications to kill that vegetation. And just a note on that, it is kind of a necessary evil in restoration that we do have to use herbicides occasionally. But if you look at what the pesticides that were dumped on this golf course annually, year after year after year, our one-time kind of 1-year application to prepare this site is really negligible compared to what was continually dumped on this site in the past. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. And then once we prep the site, then we're ready to plant. So this is this photo was taken almost exactly 1 year ago. We had about 50 volunteers out one day, and just all with buckets of seed, walking across the site, planting that newly created native grassland. So this might be the time that you're wondering, well, what are we planting, right? What's in those seed buckets? What is the end goal of restoration? And that's a great question if that was in your head, and if it wasn't before, now it is. So I think it's worth just dwelling on that a little bit. Say, what is it that we're creating out here? What exactly is this site? What are we shooting for? So I mentioned this was kind of, it was turf grass. It's kind of this blank slate situation, right? No remnant vegetation. Well, it still has some structure, right? There are still differences across the site. There's these trees that exist. There is a mix of native and non-native things, but most of it we can live with. Some of it we're phasing out. But there's trees we want to retain. There's differences in hydrology. There's wetter areas, there's drier areas. The soils are varied throughout. So it's not like we're working with nothing. But as we're planting prairie species or oak savanna species underneath these towering silver maples, what is that then? Is that some new community type? Is that a silver maple savanna? Right? How about these areas that have these wacky combinations of trees already, a spruce, elm, cherry forest, perhaps? Those things would not be, you can't find those in Michigan Natural Features Inventory. They might smirk a little bit when they see those things. How about a dry mesic wet prairie, right? Is there these areas that have, very dry spots next to very wet spots, which occur all throughout the site because of the disturbed soils and hydrology? Can we have, dry species right next to wet species in these open areas? What community is that? So I think it's helpful to take a little sidebar and talk for a second about novel ecosystems. And if this was a in-person presentation, I'd poll you all and ask for some definitions of novel ecosystems. So maybe just think to yourself, one, have you heard that term before? And two, what does that mean? But I'll tell you what the Society for Ecological Restoration says, that novel ecosystem is a site that, because of deliberate or unintentional human activity, has composition, structure, or function with no natural analog. So a couple of things there. One is this note about deliberate or unintentional human activity. So it could mean because we planted something weird there, that becomes a novel ecosystem, or it could be byproduct of some other activity, right? And then it has these characteristics that don't compare to any system that exists in nature otherwise, right? So these are novel ecosystems. I think a couple of examples would help. I'm going to show you 3 different examples, and you can think to yourself whether these are novel ecosystems or not. The first one here is, this looks like somebody's yard. I pulled this off the web. Maybe it's one of your front yards. But this really great little bioswale here. Looks like there's some mix of native and non-native plants. Certainly some great pollinator habitat. Looks like some Carex crenita, which is a lovely little sedge there. Next to this turf grass, and looks like a box elder. Maybe some hickories back there. In my mind, definitely a novel ecosystem, right? It's a pretty wacky assemblage. But at the same time, it's probably, at least from the picture, providing some pretty important ecological functions, right? You've got some pollinator habitat, and with those insects come the birds, no doubt. And it looks like it's down in this little swale here, so there's probably some water filtration going on there. So it's got aesthetic appeal as well. So even though this is a completely novel ecosystem, still providing some important functions. Let's move to a different system here. This is a Great Lakes coastal wetland in western Lake Erie, and a stand of invasive Phragmites that is taken over. So novel ecosystem. I think you could make that argument. I mean, Phragmites, the spread of Phragmites has been facilitated by humans, of course, and being in a Lake Erie that has all these nutrient pollution issues from agricultural runoff. This is a species that really thrives on that and just really expands under those conditions. If you look closely, there's some novel geology here down in the left-hand corner. There's some limestone riprap that has been brought in. So I think certainly a much different kind of ecosystem than the last one, but a novel ecosystem nonetheless. How about this one? This is Glacier National Park. Novel ecosystem. Looks pretty pristine. A beautiful view for sure. Mountains, greenery. I guess one hint is it's Glacier National Park. The foot of this glacier, which is hardly there anymore, used to extend halfway through this valley. Now we're looking at exposed soils that have never really been exposed at these latitudes before, these altitudes. You'll notice over on the right-hand side of the picture, there's these areas that are look like kind of slumped soil. Those used to be frozen and now are slumping down. And that's a newly exposed soil, and there's species popping up in there that are typically only found at much lower elevations. Now they're moving up and colonizing these new sites, never been in those areas before. So of course, climate change is kind of the trump card here. Sorry for the term, but you can make the argument that any ecosystem, regardless of how pristine it may look, because of climate change, is even in some subtle ways becoming more of a novel ecosystem. So now that we're a little bit more comfortable with what novel ecosystems are, and you know, do we like our silver maple savannas? You know, what are we doing here? Creating these spruce, elm, and cherry forests, these dry music wet prairies. Should we be doing that? Are we doing that? My answer would be yes. and the reason for that is the Highlands is and always will be a novel ecosystem. And let me be very clear, this is not a lowering of standards by any means. We're as concerned about biodiversity, or maybe even more about biodiversity on a site like this than other sites. We're just a little less concerned about what species make up that diversity. We're really, instead of trying to restore a system to some historic condition that might be a certain forest type or a certain wetland type that was there in the past, we're looking to what can survive in the future and what will continue to maintain ecosystem function in the future. So much more concerned about biodiversity and ecosystem function than particular sets of species. So with that in mind, we can talk about some of these communities that we've been working in addition to the grasslands. Working with our existing forest canopy, it's not very much, and it mostly is in lines following these fairways. I mentioned we are starting to phase out some of the exotic invasive species. There's some Scotch pine and Norway maple that we're slowly phasing out by girdling, leaving them standing for wildlife habitat, of course. But then planting into these existing corridors, looking at where are there forested patches offsite, perhaps on Blandford's existing land, on other neighboring lands, then we could connect via these forested corridors. And so this year, in fact, just this morning, I was out with our stewardship crew planting about 400 trees. We planted about 1,000 a couple months ago, and in the coming years, we will have several thousand trees that we will be planting in certain portions of this site. Those trees, of course, with a nod to future conditions, are things that we think will be able to survive here in these novel conditions. But it's a wacky assemblage of things, to be sure. Wetlands is another thing that we've been focused a lot on. One of the first things we noticed when we started walking out here shortly after we acquired it is many of the areas of the site just hold water. After even modest rains, water sits on the surface. Some of that's due to the soils for sure. Some of that's due to the lowness on the landscape that this site, portions of the site sit. When it was a golf course, this whole thing was drained and tiled, meaning that there were underground pipes installed to keep the water off the surface, to keep dry conditions for golfing. Over the years, some of those have sort of stopped working very well, and so we have water pooling up. This is an old sand trap. Some of those sites continue to, or some of those drains continue to function fairly well, and they are just shuttling that water off site. So we wanted to find where all those drains were. And once we find where those drains were, we can go in and strategically break them at areas where the topography allows that water to back up. So this is just a picture of one such drain. This is just a small corrugated drain. We were able to go in and break that up. This is minutes after we did that, and there's already water pooling in behind it. Just a side note here, looking at the various golf balls you can see in this photo. So there's enough golf balls out there in the substrate to make it a significant component of the substrate. So hey, another novel soils thing there that we're working with. So on a larger scale, this is what that work looks like. This is along the north end of the property. Historically, there was a drain that ran all the way through this old fairway with a bunch of different drains pulling into it. And so it's just a matter of looking at where there were already natural depressions in the landscape, where we could go in and break those, break that pipe up, create a shallow berm, and then have water pool in behind. So this is what that work looks like a little closer up. This is kind of constructing that little berm there. We were able to take some of these Norway spruce and less desirable trees, place those in, take those out and place those in the wetland where they'll provide organic matter and habitat in the meantime. And anybody who's been out to the site, those are absolute bird magnets now. Everything perches on there. We had some just great warblers coming through earlier this year and a variety of other things. I like this picture too because it really reminds me of when I was standing here that day watching this work in action, as this excavator was kind of digging through these layers of 3-4 feet of this light colored soil. Dug down and got into this rich black muck. And that was a clue to me that, there must have been a wetland here in the past. And a couple things resonated with me there. One is that we don't necessarily want to take it back to the past, but we want to say, okay, what could this wetland be in the future? And I think that's really powerful to think about this site in a new lens, looking at both the past and the future. it's easy for me as somebody who's out here often to think of this as a former golf course. And that's sort of how I framed this entire talk, right? This is a golf course that we're converting. But really that was only about 100 years worth of this site's history. Before that, it would have been forest, wetland, prairie. And so what does it mean for us to be taking providing continuity from that thousands of years of natural habitat, this blip of 100 years or so as a golf course, and then bringing that in the next 1,000 years of nature. And that's a really exciting way, at least for me, to think about it. And it was kind of a turning point for me on the project as well. Just quickly here, one more habitat we're working on is there is a stream on the east side of the property. If you walk out there today, you wouldn't see it because it is contained in a 48-inch pipe about 6 to 8 feet underground. And so this was all part of the drainage system of the golf course put in by the Drain Commission many, many years ago. And so we've been working with a couple of partners to reimagine that and put that stream back on the surface where it belongs, with natural meanders, riffles, pools, the whole works. And so that work will be starting in the spring. So very, very excited about that. Here's a rendering of what that could look like. A water course through the property, again, with some human use integrated as well. So as you can see, some of this is very much works in progress, right? We've only had about 3 years on this site, and not all of those 3 years have been spent doing habitat restoration. And a lot of it was this groundwork, getting ready to implement some of this. But already we can see some successes. And here's where, if you're a golfer, I might offend you a little bit. I'm sorry. But you know, a major success, at least in my mind and from a natural values perspective, it's not a golf course anymore, right? So as a golf course, the Highlands would have applied about 50,000 pounds of chemicals per year, 1,600 pounds in pesticides. The rest was chemical fertilizers. So these are average statistics from typical golf courses. These are not from the Highlands, but it would have been very similar. Right, it would have consumed about 800,000 gallons of water per day. This golf course was irrigated by a series of wells throughout the property, and that's all water that is being sucked out of the water table and then largely evaporated. Very little of it was actually taken up by grass. All the stormwater was piped off site, which I think is kind of ironic. They're pulling water up from aquifers, putting it on the grass, but at the same time, every ounce of stormwater they're trying to get off the site as quickly as possible. Supported virtually no wildlife habitat. Some golf courses certainly are better than others. This one, because it had no kind of natural spaces in between those fairways, was turf grass border to border, very little in the way of wildlife habitat, and provided community benefits to only a select few, namely paying golfers. So even just in the first couple of years as a natural area, the Highlands uses zero fertilizer, minimal pesticides, and zero water extraction. Infiltrates over 4 million gallons of water per year. That's a very lowball estimate. It's probably much more than that. It will be even higher, northwards of 12 million gallons of water per year. Again, a conservative estimate after we daylight that stream. As of today, we've planted about 40 acres of wildlife habitat. Some of that's coming quite quickly. You can see this photo behind me. A lot of those native things are already starting to come in. And when we're done, we'll have converted about 100 acres of this 120-acre site to native high-functioning wildlife habitat. And then broad community benefits. We estimate there were about 50,000 visitors last year. This year would have been even higher with everybody flocking to the outdoors because of the pandemic. So probably much higher than this. And it's open to the public for free. There's no charge. Another great success, if you look beyond, it's not just a golf course, is really the instant biodiversity response. And that's what has impressed me most about this site is as soon as we implement some of these things, as soon as we plant, as soon as we install these wetlands, it's getting massive use by insects, by birds, by all different guilds of species. So wetlands, this wetland here, this is the former driving range of the golf course, and now it's a wetland that each year continues to mature and change. And it was a couple months after we installed this wetland when they were breeding frogs and toads here. Turtles, we have, last year there were a pair of green herons around here, sandhill cranes, great blue herons. Just bird life is flocking to these areas. So a couple more photos here, killdeer nesting on the shores, monarch butterflies. And then people too, for whatever reason, seem to just really be enthralled with this place. Land Conservancy certainly can't take a whole lot of credit for it, but people just want to be out here for some reason. They want to be a part of it. They want to experience it. I think a lot of them, especially the neighbors, are just glad it's not a housing development. But it's been really fun to engage with a lot of these folks, bring them into the restoration process, as well as just see many people enjoying the property. I still look at pictures like this one on the right with all these people together and think, oh my gosh, they're not wearing masks. But that was a pre-pandemic picture. All right, so it's not all rainbows and unicorns out there, or whatever the metaphor is. We have had challenges, to be sure, because of the site and where it sits on the landscape. And so I wanted to share some of that. So I got on my high horse a little bit about novel ecosystems, and I do think that's a helpful framework to think about restoration projects like this. But at the same time, the downside of that is there's so much uncertainty involved with that. This is a photo of shortly after we put in another wetland on the property last year. It's already filled up partially with water. We have all this this bare soil. We have some upland areas, clearly some wetland areas that will be developing. I cannot tell you what this site is going to look like in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years. I don't know what that looks like, right? What I can tell you, though, is that it will have a lot of different species. It will provide a lot of wildlife habitat, and it will have some upland and wetland components. And that's about it. We just don't have a playbook for this. And so that, in one sense, that provides a lot of opportunity, and that's really exciting work. In another sense, it can be frustrating, especially if we're working with funders or partners or donors who want to know what this area is going to look like. And also for managing expectations from the public and say, what are you doing here? When is this going to look like this beautiful prairie or forest or whatever? It's hard to answer some of those questions because we just don't know. The urban setting, of course, adds complexity to everything that we're doing out there. When we're doing prescribed burns, for example, there's smoke management considerations with schools and retirement homes and all that nearby. Working with loud equipment and annoying neighbors. Working around those utilities. We can't just go digging wherever we want. We prefer to avoid electrocuting ourselves, for example. Also, with as many eyes on the project as there is, when we're creating these wetlands in essentially these neighbors' backyards, right? They have a legitimate concern, perhaps, of being flooded out. So it's mitigating some of those concerns and actually designing our project so they don't flood people out. Another, getting back to managing expectations, is despite the high enthusiasm, some of the neighbors are concerned that it's looking weedy and overgrown. And my response is, well, that's kind of the point. But at the same time, it is managing some of those expectations, as well as sometimes tweaking what we do on the ground to make sure that we are providing some aesthetic benefit as well. So getting back to that notion that this is for nature and people, right? And just a kind of a catch-all one here with 50,000 plus people walking through here every day, high profile in the middle of the city. There's just a lot of eyes on the project and a lot of opinions to consider as well. And so just another quick note on that, that all takes time and effort to manage from our staff, from volunteers, to manage all those opinions of neighbors and others. All the partnerships are wonderful. This project could not happen without strong partnerships, but that does take time to cultivate, to manage, to implement well, so that those are actually working strong partnerships and that get something done and isn't simply something on paper. And then expectations, right? We are looking at this project as a 20-year, 50-year, even 100-year project. We're implementing things now on the ground that we won't see the fruits of for time frames of on the order of decades, right? We just planted a bunch of oak trees this morning. That's a 300-year project. And so managing those and being real about what we're doing out there and what can we offer people now in terms of some of those faster growing things, right? Those prairies, those showy wildflowers versus some of those longer time frame projects. So I touched on partnerships and just wanted to end by noting some of these strong partners that we've had in this project. This is just a handful of them. There are many more. I'd be remiss if I didn't call out U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for their support of the wetland work, as well as much of the upland planting. Blandford, of course, has been a tremendous partner in all of this. The city of Grand Rapids and Eagle have been amazingly supportive of our desire to pull up that stream that's in that pipe now. And those are our two, city of Grand Rapids and Eagle are two main partners on that project, which will be moving forward next year. So it takes a lot of different folks with a lot of different specialties to make something like this happen. So this is just a handful of them. And with that, I will say thank you for bearing with me and bearing with the Zoom format. And I'm not sure if there are any questions in the chat yet, but I will stop sharing and maybe we can field some of those.
Yeah, if you want to turn the host back over, I can kind of field the questions and just kind of give you a chance to respond. If you do have a question as a member of our club, you can insert that into the chat. I think that would be the best way to kind of give everyone an equal chance. We'll field as many questions as Justin's got time for and not bombard them with questions. Justin, there was a few that came in during your presentation.
Where are they?
All right.
I can actually see them too.
Okay,
if you want to, I'll let you moderate and you can.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think the first one was, are deer a threat to your new planning effort?
Now that's a fantastic question and one of the ones that's been on our mind since the beginning. One of the first things we did, I don't know if you, in that one of the slides I showed of the pilot planting project, we were actually planting some of that in a deer exclosure. So we did build a big fence that you might, if you've been on the site, you've probably seen, just to get a sense of how much deer we're eating out there. There is a huge herd of very friendly and tame deer out there that have the potential to be eating machines. So we wanted to be sure that we weren't just throwing money away by planting expensive deer candy. And so over the last 3 years, we've been kind of monitoring that. And the consensus is from at least that exclosure that yes, deer have an impact on vegetation, but it's maybe not as much as we would have thought. I think the real test will be when we get into some of these tree plantings like we've been doing lately. We're just planting, bare root seedlings and plugs, so very small trees. the survivability of those, I think, will be the real test. Right now, we've opted not to do any sort of a formal protection of those, just because of the labor involved in that and the expense, frankly. But what we have done is tried our best to tuck them into areas where there's already tall vegetation, and so that we're not simply planting into this open bare soil area where deer can just come along and have a have a buffet. And so we'll see how well that works, and we'll adjust as needed.
Is Highlands the newest project for the Land Conservancy? And what is your most established project? There's kind of a two-part there.
Yeah, so no, we're constantly doing projects. In fact, our newest project is a large addition to Flower Creek Dunes Nature Preserve, which is up in near Montague. So we were able to work with a conservation easement landowner to purchase his property and add about 40 acres onto that preserve. So if you haven't been to Flower Creek Dunes Preserve before, awesome spot, highly recommended. We're always working to either purchase new properties, do these community partnership projects like the Highlands, and work with private landowners to do conservation easements. So we've done a number of those this year. Our most established project, not quite sure how to answer that, but one of my favorite projects, let's answer that question instead, and one of our most established is Salt Lake Bog Nature Preserve, which was established in 1989. It's in the Rockford area. Great birding action on the bog and in the prairie if you haven't been there. Salt Lake Bog is certainly one of my favorites and one of the most well-known of our projects.
The next question, and it kind of got people thinking about the novel ecosystems, but would you say they're neutral, positive, or negative as like an ecosystem?
You know, it's hard. Yeah. That's a really good question. And my response is novel ecosystems are here to stay. So they are what they are. We're not getting around them. I think it's been, I'm old enough that when I went to school in conservation, it was very much using this historical paradigm, this historical, restore to some pristine condition in the past. And I think over the last, 15 years or so, things have really started to shift. And that's uncomfortable at times. And there certainly are times that we still are going to manage systems and restore systems to these kind of historical conditions. That's absolutely appropriate in many circumstances, and still is. But I think when you have, especially these systems that are so disturbed and so manipulated, that any notion of trying to fight that is probably counterproductive. Instead, it makes a little bit more sense to work with that and be okay with what results or what comes as a result. It's a little bit of a cop-out there, but I would say novel ecosystems as a concept, I think is positive in that it's helpful to bring restoration forward.
There's been a lot of comments and not as much questions, but it's just people are amazed to see how quickly the land has recovered, how quickly the restoration. We know that when given the opportunity, we've even seen during the COVID pandemic how nature can kind of take over when we're not as much present. So that's been really neat to see. A lot of our members, myself, we've been out there, and it's been great to see how quickly that land has recovered from being a golf course. How many acres is the Highlands?
It's 121 acres. Yep. And I should note too, I kind of skipped over some of the nuts and bolts of the acquisition details, but people always ask, well, does Blandford own it? Does the Land Conservancy own it? The answer is yes. We each own different parts of it. Blandford owns about 2/3 of it. We own about 1/3. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter. The Land Conservancy is managing the whole thing as a single unit, of course, in partnership with Blandford, just as Blandford's going to use the whole thing for its environmental programming and things like that. So the idea is to keep it as a single contiguous piece. It doesn't matter where the boundary line is. but it is a shared ownership.
Try to fit in two more questions. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Besides planting trees, what are you planning to replace turfgrass? And you kind of touched on some of controlled ferns and more of a natural prairie. What else is being planted?
Yeah, so most of the upland areas we're planting with a mix of kind of typical prairie savanna species. Again, thinking broadly here, we're not 100% sure what's going to survive on the site, what's going to grow well in these strange conditions. And so we're going for really high diversity mixes. And that's our goal. And I think those will shake out over time. And so each year our mixes get a little bit more ambitious maybe. Next, we were hoping to do a large volunteer work day next week where we're planting 25 acres of seed down in an area we've been working to prep throughout the year with the new health department order restricting outdoor gatherings to a certain size. We're not able to do that. So we're still implementing that. It's just, it's going to take a little bit more work from our staff and a few volunteers. But yep, we'll be putting that down in a week or so. And then in the wetland areas, sort of a similar approach, obviously a different seed mix there, but aiming for broad spectrum things that require inundated conditions versus partially flooded. Some of these wetlands, we have a general sense of hydrology, but we're not really sure what they're going to do over time. They certainly do fluctuate through the seasons. If you've been out there, over the course of a year or so, you've probably seen that. And so the idea is to really aim for high diversity and see what shakes out.
Our last question, and would just be a good one to finish off, especially coming from the Grand Rapids Audubon Club. Any birding surprises out there?
I will admit I'm not the strongest birder out there, but I was thrilled to see the green herons. Last year, they were hanging around one of those wetlands all summer long. And I don't know, maybe as some of you could, were able to confirm nesting. I know talking to a couple folks, it looked like they were in the business of nesting, but they're just really cool birds, and they're not the most common thing in the world. And to see them hanging around a 1.5-year-old wetland in the middle of an urban area was pretty cool.
All right. Well, we thank you for your time and your work that you're doing out at the Highlands and restoring that property, as well as just working to restore many of our what were once natural landscapes back to their original place.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and the time, and wish you all the best in your work.
Thank you. Scott, do you have anything?
Good presentation, Justin. Thank you.
Yeah, we will continue to look to having our meetings via Zoom. Scott, if you want to add anything tonight, we have things lined up for January 30th is our next meeting. Scott, I'll kind of turn it over to you to close us out.
When we resume normal meetings, Aquinas is set up for online part of that with no extra charge to us. So we'll be able to put the meetings online for people to watch who can't make it there, who are, I think that's just a natural extension of this. That's about all I got.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Justin, for your time tonight, for sharing with us. And we really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone that came out tonight via Zoom. We had at 1.54 people. So I think that's a really good turnout for our first Zoom club meeting.
For sure.
We can see there are 2 people in some of those 54 windows too.
Yeah. So we probably had more than that. We had 54 participants. But yeah, for sure.
Hey, Scott, could we open up just a minute to what are people doing about how are they going to conduct the Christmas count?
The Christmas count's going to be just people driving from their homes with only people of their own household, counting an area, going home, and then emailing in the results. We're not going to have any meetings, we don't want anybody birding with anybody that they're not exposed to all the time anyway. So it's going to be a much more smaller scale than we usually do, but at least we didn't skip the year.
I was just wondering if people would go like in multiple cars, sort of caravan, but
that will be up to them. We still are talking with the section leaders about how they're going to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm not actually involved in that planning at all. That's mostly been Tom Leggett and Steve Mueller and Chris Baird, people involved in it every year. So, but yeah, I guess you can travel in a caravan.
Mhm.
Whether you want to get out and look at something together is going to depend more on the weather than anything else at this point.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
As a section leader, I'm just going to divide up my section with the people who have told me they're going to participate and let them know where they're going, what the boundaries of their area are. And then they'll do it on their own.
Yeah, I'm a section leader too, Katie. And I was just wondering how other section leaders were doing that. That sounds like a really good idea.
Well, I just sent out an email and said, who's interested in doing it?
Yeah.
So I'd know how many people I could divide it up
Mhm.
among. And
Yeah.
so that's what I'm doing.
Good plan.
Sounds good. Anybody else? Okay, I think that's it then.